Hey everyone, my name is Elvira Barry. I am an author born in the USSR, and today we are going to take a tour of the world of Russian military propaganda and see how it's all set up. In this world, we'll find real devils, suffocating clouds of lies and scorching frying pans of hatred where the souls of sinners are being fried. In other words, welcome to hell. Propaganda only works when it taps into a person's deep-rooted fears. It's especially powerful when someone or their loved ones has experienced something truly awful, and they are terrified it might happen again. The main fears of modern Russians can be divided into the following categories. External attack. The reasons for this are well known. During World War II, the USSR lost tens of millions of people. There wasn't a single family that didn't have someone killed in that war. Economic collapse. This is a fear that Russians have lived through at least 4 times in the last 100 years. The first was the civil war after the Bolshevik Revolution. The second was during Stalin's industrialization, when the country's resources were all diverted to building up the military industry. The third was the devastation after World War II. The fourth was the collapse of the Soviet Union. An important side note: diplomacy, peace, and healthy relationships between nations are only possible when people study each other's history and culture and understand each other's motivations. That's why I write historical novels about the most important events that shaped Russia into what it is today. Its roots lie in the Russian Empire, and especially in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. This period is the focus of my novel, Russian Treasures. Click the link in the description to learn more. The next fear is nuclear war. Back in Soviet times, we were constantly terrified that the Americans would drop a nuclear bomb on our peaceful cities. It's a childhood trauma for my entire generation. This generation, and those who are older than us, are the decision makers in Russia today. Next fear, the disintegration of the country. This fear revolves around the loss of national identity. I've had many conversations with immigrants from smaller countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Denmark, and others. They don't have the slightest desire to consider themselves citizens of a great power. But for Russians, this is hugely important. When your personal life feels insignificant and there's little to be proud of, you make up for it by being proud of your country. But if the country breaks apart, then who are you? Just a poor resident of the Republic of Penza or the Kingdom of Yekaterinburg? Moreover, the disintegration of the country is associated with defeat and economic collapse. And that's just awful. Next fear, sexualized violence. During the Soviet era, millions of people went through prison, and social hierarchies there were often based on who had subjected whom to sexual violence. To be a rooster, or a passive gay man in prison slang, was to sink to the very bottom of the social ladder. Next fear, the fear of rejection. We are not liked, we are never accepted anywhere, we are hated and always mistreated. This fear likely stems from the childhood trauma of a typical Soviet child who was bullied and felt utterly powerless while the adults around them remained indifferent. The fear that authority, the one in charge, can be wrong. Since ordinary people have no say in political or financial decisions, they must rely on the wisdom and foresight of their rulers. If the authorities make a mistake, it could lead to disaster. But if they are right, everything will be fine. So people just hope that their rulers know what they are doing. All of these fears are fully exploited by propaganda, and that's why it's so effective. But only in certain social circles. But why doesn't propaganda work on everyone? Because not all Russians have these fears. People who have traveled the world, speak foreign languages, and have a decent education are scared by entirely different things. They fear the destruction of the family world. A new wave of purges like those under Stalin, repression, mass arrests, and torture. Many people are afraid that their country will be completely closed off, the internet will be blocked, and Russia will turn into North Korea. They are scared to fly on airplanes because Russian planes are no longer properly maintained. They are scared to get seriously ill because many essential medications are simply unavailable. There are no sanctions of these drugs, but they still don't get purchased because payment is nearly impossible due to the sanctions. And of course, the government is funneling money into war rather than healthcare. Business owners are afraid they'll have to close their businesses because they can't import the necessary supplies. If it's a large business, they fear it might be taken away because it might catch the eye of those in power. People are also afraid that their children won't have a future and that they'll be corrupted the way Hitler, Pol Pot, and Mao corrupted their youth, turning them into soulless fanatics. But these fears can't be spoken aloud. In fact, if someone starts voicing these concerns, they could end up in prison for a long time. That's why we have no idea how many people are truly influenced by official propaganda and how many are not. We can only judge by indirect signs or by asking friends and acquaintances. In general, sociology doesn't work in Russia because people are afraid to answer questions. The choice is simple. Do you support the president? Or should we throw you in prison for 5 years? Under those circumstances, a person will, of course, say that they support everything, even if that's not true at all. Now, let's break down the official Russian narrative and see what's wrong with it. Once upon a time, there was a wonderful country, the USSR, which defeated the Nazis and strived to build communism. Everyone was given apartments for free. People lived simply but harmoniously. Everyone helped each other. Everyone was fed. Great works of art were created. We flew into space and we won Olympic golds. But then, Gorbachev and his American buddies destroyed this wonderful country and handed it over to the oligarchs who looted the nation's wealth and started smuggling money out of the country. Then came President Putin, who gradually restored order. Life got much better. Many people bought cars and apartments, private businesses sprouted, and people started going to resorts. The demographic situation improved, alcohol consumption went down, and the prison population shrank. Putin made Russia a great country again, well respected on the world stage. He defeated ISIS and, most importantly, started reclaiming the lands that initially, by right, belonged to the USSR. Crimea, which was seized from Ukraine in 2014, was the crown jewel of the Russian Empire. It's not just about the important ports on the Black Sea. In the mind of an average Russian, Crimea is the land of happiness. The climate there is similar to Northern California, but the sea is much warmer. People used to vacation there to bask in the sun and swim in the sea, and for many current Russian officials who come from families in the old Soviet elite, Crimea is associated with childhood nostalgia. In short, it's a place of immense value. And they believe that if something you love belongs to someone else who clearly mishandling it, you take it back. Some people in the West support the idea of spheres of influence and believe that the Russian government has the right to claim any territory within their zone. They fail to see the people living there as individuals with their own opinions and desires. The call to give Ukraine to Russia essentially means give Putin millions of people and let them live in a pariah state under sanctions, without rights and with bleak prospects for the future. This may seem easy when Ukrainian is just an abstraction. But if you look a living person in the eyes and tell them their life and future are merely part of a sphere of influence for some old man in Moscow, then who are you? But Russia will ultimately fail in its imperialistic dream. In modern times, the desire to restore the empire only arises in those who are ignorant of history, economics, and demography. The age of empires ended because would-be imperialists did not have an abundance of young men they would send off to conquer and colonize other countries. Russia's demographic pyramid looks like this. Young Russian men in their 20s and 30s are in short supply and they can't even meet the needs of the country. That's why Russia is experiencing a severe labor shortage right now. And that's despite the fact that many hundreds of young men are dying and being maimed every day on the front lines in Ukraine. Empires can only be dreamed of when every family have several spare boys. But when you have one precious son, forget about world domination. It's not going to happen even if you have all the money in the world, which is not our case. Revanchism is the backbone of modern Russian propaganda. The empire is presented as an absolute value, one worth fighting and dying for. Transnistria, Georgia, Ukraine, and all the other former Soviet republics are seen as our lands that were taken from us. Who took them? The damned West. The defeat in the Cold War must be reversed, and we need to return to the glory days when the USSR had its own sphere of influence and could do whatever it wanted within its borders. And if the West resists, we threaten them with oil and gas cuts and nuclear weapons. There's a popular saying in Russian internet circles: a nation that doesn't respect its army will soon be feeding someone else's. Propaganda does everything it can to instill pride in Russia's tanks, rockets, and soldiers. People slap stickers on their cars that read "March on Berlin." We can do it again. And political talk show hosts confidently threaten to turn the US into radioactive ash. But revanchism won't work either. Anyone can compare the economic and scientific potential of Russia and the West. Militarism will end as soon as oil prices fall, and the government won't be able to finance its costly foreign policy escapades. I have a separate video on this topic. Check it out. I explain where Russian leaders get the money to fund their wars. Propaganda portrays Putin as the only leader capable of securing Russian interests in an increasingly hostile world. For many, the very idea of replacing him is deeply unsettling. For the first time in history, the Russian population has seen slight improvements in their standards of living over the past few decades, and they are terrified of losing that progress. This improvement in quality of life was largely driven by high oil prices, which provided the Russian government with ample funds for military ventures, lavish lifestyles of officials, and improvements to urban infrastructure. People who have never studied history or economics often attribute these successes to Putin, since they occurred during his time in power. But the image of Putin as the only viable option didn't happen by chance. Over the years, he has systematically purged any competition, ensuring that no other political figures rise to challenge his leadership. Opponents have been silenced, either through imprisonment, exile, or murder, while alternative voices have been stifled by state-controlled media. The USSR's greatest legacy is a completely atomized society that doesn't believe in the possibility of collective action. But the soul still craves it. Furthermore, the soul craves religious experience. But religion was crushed in the USSR, and several generations grew up disconnected from religious traditions. Faith in communist ideology somewhat filled this void. But after the collapse of the USSR, a large gap appeared. The only thing that unites the deeply divided Russian society is the celebration of Victory Day on May 9th. In the late USSR, this was a day of nationwide remembrance for the fallen. People would take flowers to monuments and graves, host dinners, and attend parades. Veterans, of course, didn't like to talk about the war, but as they died off, the holiday took on an entirely new meaning. The idea we liberated the world from the Nazis and the damned West doesn't appreciate it and tries to claim our victory became central. May 9th gatherings began to resemble a religious procession. Only instead of icons, citizens carried enlarged portraits of their relatives who fought in the Great Patriotic War. This procession is called the Immortal Regiment. This is a true cult of ancestors, and it is heavily fueled from the top. Corresponding symbols, uniforms, greeting cards, and ritual songs have all appeared. Mass-produced, highly sentimental films are made, which hold as much truth as Goebbels' propaganda. Talking about the problems, mistakes, and crimes of that war is forbidden. That would be sacrilege and Russophobia, which is anti-Russian sentiment. Russophobia is a term invented by the Kremlin's propaganda machine. The idea behind it is that people in the West are inherently biased and unfair toward Russia, so we can never expect a fair evaluation of ourselves or our actions. If you look it up in Russian Wikipedia, you'll find a huge article about how we are disliked, and have always been. There is no sign of Russophobia if a person studies foreign languages and starts reading and communicating with people from other countries. If you behave decently, no one in the civilized world will accuse you of being of the wrong nationality. I've experienced it firsthand. I've lived in the West for 20 years and had never encountered any Russophobia. However, there are few exceptions to this rule. Immediately after the war started in February 2022, an employee from Ukraine at a large American IT company where my friend works wrote in their corporate chat that all Russians should be fired immediately and completely avoided. This person was under extreme stress and desperately wanted to help his country but didn't know how. So he came up with this brilliant idea. But it was quickly explained to him that a developed civilization is based on individual, not collective responsibility. And if he suggests punishing innocent people simply because of their nationality, then how is he any different from Putin and his cronies? It's important to note that people with Russian citizenship indeed face problems when they flee the country because of war, but only if they are poor. If they are fled Russia carrying just a suitcase, they can't open bank accounts. It's extremely hard for them to find work in Europe. Occasionally, they encounter rude and ignorant people who put up signs saying "No Russian served," or harass them if they hear Russian spoken in the street. But the wealthy people and the Russian officials have no problem keeping their money in Western banks, buying property, or going on vacation to the best European resorts. Somehow they cry about Russophobia at every opportunity, but don't practice what they preach. Every citizen of the Russian Federation knows that corruption, lies, and widespread theft dominate the country. But propaganda convinces people that this is the way things are everywhere, and it's the norm. Complaining is pointless, fighting is futile, and the only option is to accept the system. To reinforce this idea, the media selectively presents news that supports the narrative. See? Their politicians are just like us. So why do they keep lecturing us on human rights? Probably because of Russophobia. The same message is drilled into the minds of foreign viewers and readers through social media and commentators who are eagerly repeating the opinions they've been fed. Do you know what they called in Russia? Useful idiots. When I was younger, Soviet television constantly broadcasted how bad things were in Western Europe and the US. Soviet correspondents didn't fabricate anything. They simply showed one side of the story while concealing the other, creating a skewed image. For example, they would visit areas with homeless people and sadly remark, This is how modern Americans live. The same thing is happening now. A piece of news is exaggerated to create a narrative that the West is falling apart. Unemployment, homelessness, people can't afford food, and children are taken from families and raised by gay couples. Furthermore, there are constant natural disasters, which are presented as punishment for their sins. Just recently, there were fires in Los Angeles, and I received a flood of messages from my Russian readers urging me to move back to Russia. Everything has burned down over there. This narrative serves two purposes. First, it suppresses the will to resist in Russia. If human rights, fair elections, and systems of checks and balances don't work, there's no point in challenging the regime. Second, it breaks the will of people in the West, instilling uncertainty and apathy. When I see people in the US or other democratic countries say, "It's all the same as in Russia," I can't help but sigh. It's simply untrue. This idea has been pushed by those who know exactly how to manipulate your emotions, and a person who does not trust those around them can't resist. They are already defeated. After the collapse of the USSR, Eastern European countries began joining NATO one by one. This military defensive alliance, designed to help members in the event of military aggression, immediately raised alarms among Russian leaders. It does not matter what the people of Poland, the Czech Republic, and other countries want. It doesn't matter that they have every reason to fear aggression from Russia, as each of these countries has suffered from Russian imperialism. What matters is that they left Russia's sphere of influence, undermining its power and significance. The idea of Ukraine seeking closer ties with Europe and applying for NATO membership was simply unacceptable. Once again, it doesn't matter what the Ukrainians want. It doesn't matter that they have every reason to fear aggression. What truly matters is that by joining NATO, Ukraine could potentially receive support from other member states. But of course, Russian propagandists don't frame it this way. They presented NATO's presence at its border as a direct threat to Russia's security, conveniently ignoring the fact that Russia has bordered NATO since 1949, when Norway joined the alliance. Why would NATO members want to attack Russia? Because you, ladies and gentlemen, are eager to seize Russia's natural resources and enslave its people. This idea deeply disturbs Russia's elites, as they believe only they have the right to exploit Russia's resources and enslave its people, and no one else. A great power cannot make mistakes, and its high-ranking official cannot be held accountable for anything. Therefore, when something terrible happens, propaganda quickly shifts the blame onto someone else. In 2014, Russian troops who invaded Donbass shot down Malaysia airline flight MH17. 298 people died. There's ample evidence that Russians were responsible, but they still deny it and claim the plane was downed by Ukrainians. The invasion of Crimea and Donbass was also disguised. It was supposedly not the professional army, but the local residents who somehow managed to acquire weapons and military equipment. Who bombed Aleppo? No idea. Who interfered with the US elections and flooded social media with bots? Oh, you did it, deliberately to frame us. Who poisoned Alexei Navalny? He just died. Who staged the massacre in Ukrainian cities in Bucha and Irpin? Ukrainians blew themselves up and shot each other to accuse the innocent occupiers. Lies and the refusal to acknowledge mistakes are just ridiculous. It's not even villain-like. It's childish. Can you imagine Genghis Khan, after sacking a city, shyly looking away and saying, "Oh, that's not me. Maybe the locals destroyed the city themselves." For a long time, the war in Ukraine was not seen as a war with the Ukrainian people. After all, a large number of Russians have relatives and friends there. How could our people kill those just like us, right? The war was framed as being against Ukrainian Nazis, who allegedly oppressed Russians in eastern Ukraine and forbade everybody from speaking Russian. The Ukrainian Revolution, which saw the pro-Russian president ousted in Kiev, was viewed as a direct attack on Russia. The Ukrainian people couldn't have done it themselves, right? After all, who would want to leave the Kremlin's sphere of influence? It was all the work of the Americans, who first stirred up revolutions in Arab countries and then turned their sights on Russia, or rather its sphere of influence. I specifically asked people who believed in the existence of Ukrainian Nazis where they got this idea. The answer is simple. First, they saw countless images on TV of Ukrainian marches with torches and slogans defending Ukrainian language, culture, and so on. Then, the internet was flooded with photos of Ukrainian Nazis featuring swastika tattoos and flags. When I was sent one of those images to prove the existence of Ukrainian Nazis, I traced the original photo via Google, and there were no swastika in it. I found the swastika from the picture in the Russian search engine Yandex, where it was the first image that appeared under the search term swastika on a transparent background. Someone just pieces it all together in Photoshop. Do you think this convinced the person who sent me the image? No. He claimed that Ukrainian Nazis intentionally spread fake images to confuse people and cover their tracks. As for the claim that Russian-speaking people in Donbass were attacked for speaking their native language, here are the undeniable facts. Kharkiv, a large Ukrainian city right on the Russian border, has historically had Russian as the first language for many of its inhabitants. So, how is that Ukrainian Nazis supposedly mistreated Russian speakers in Donbass, but not in neighboring Kharkiv? I have more to say on this topic. Over the last decade, I taught creative writing in Russian. Half of my students were Ukrainians, and we are talking about tens of thousands of aspiring authors, bloggers, and journalists. Why do you think they choose to learn how to write in Russian if, supposedly, this language was being suppressed by Nazis? Because it wasn't. People chose Russian because almost everyone in Ukraine speaks it, and the publishing industry in Russian was far more profitable than in Ukrainian. However, after the invasion, many people no longer want to use Russian, as it has become a symbol of aggression. Now, the Russian propaganda machine promotes the idea that all Ukrainians are Nazis who hate everything Russian. Here, how it works. An army of paid commentators posing as Ukrainians is unleashed on social media. They write insults and completely unjust accusations in Russian, accusing Russian anti-war opposition members and intellectuals of imperialism, of wanting to continue the war, and of other sins. They attack in packs, creating the illusion that all Ukrainians are like this, and that dialogue with them is impossible. In response, Russians start to snap back, and the Kremlin gets exactly what it wants. No alliance between the Russian opposition and Ukrainians is possible. The same thing happens on Ukrainian social media. Paid commentators attack in packs, create turmoil, and fuel hatred between the two nations. Russian officials declared that they would create a new world order and unite with countries of the global south to challenge the United States. They formed the BRICS, an organization that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. The goal is to create an alternative to the G7 and form a new economic bloc. All of this is presented as a major foreign policy achievement. In reality, these countries are heavily dependent on the Western economy because their domestic markets alone are insufficient for sustainable development. The same goes for technology. The West remains influential precisely because it is indispensable. does the LGBTQ topic cause such anxiety among Russian officials? It seems like nobody should care who sleeps with whom, right? Oh no. The reason is that prison culture, with its high population in Russia, has a very strong influence on society. This particularly affects the authorities, who are deeply and closely connected with the criminal world. For many, homosexuality is simply inconceivable. It's unfathomable that anyone would choose to become a rooster. This must mean that someone corrupted them. Evil forces made them turn away from normal life and fall to the very bottom. And since the West encourages gay people, this is seen as the ultimate evil. This ideology is taken to the extreme and widely propagated. What's more, the state has banned the promotion of LGBTQ rights. Gays are actively persecuted, and on the ground, there is a real witch hunt. You can write about gays, tell their stories, or even remotely express support for them. Rumor has it that the government bans gay propaganda not because they are afraid or irritated by gays, but because there are quite a few gay politicians and high officials in Russia. And that's something that can't be discussed. Hence the ban. Xenophobia is another popular topic. In the USSR, it was primarily directed at Jews. If you're interested in learning more about Jews in the USSR, let me know in the comments. However, in recent years, xenophobia has expanded to target people from Central Asia who have come to Russia as labor migrants. The recent terrorist attack at Krakow City Hall, which resulted in 145 fatalities and 551 injuries, has only fueled the hatred toward these migrants. The problem lies in the fact that if migrants are not allowed to bring their families, it often leads to increased violence and sexual crimes. But if they do bring their wives and children, Russian cities and villages begin to feel replaced by Tajik, Uzbeks, and Kyrgyz. This issue seems to have no simple solution. While Russia's birth rate has dropped, Central Asian countries don't face this problem, and the math is clear. But no matter how many passionate posts Russian nationalists write on social media, migrants from Central Asia will continue to come because there's simply no one else to work on construction sites and in agriculture. Another key idea for Russian propaganda is traditional family values. Officially, the state supports large families, protects motherhood and childhood, and aligns itself with those who are willing to defend humanity from moral decay. Primarily, this is done to form foreign political alliances. Unlike the USSR, modern Russia has little to offer the world in terms of ideology, so how does it distinguish us from them? By proclaiming that we stand for purity and morality. But if we look at the reality on the ground, the picture is quite different. In 2024, for every 10 marriages, there were 8 divorces. In 2022, for every 100 births, there were 39 abortions. In 2024, Russia recorded a 14-year high in serious crimes, more than 684,000 cases. It's also worth looking at the biographies of Russia's top political officials. What's their stance on family values? Vladimir Putin divorced his wife, doesn't acknowledge his adult daughters, and refers to them as those women. He has an official family with Alina Kabaeva, a gymnast 31 years his junior, and a daughter from his mistress. The same pattern can be seen in the family lives of many Russian officials, as it reflects the broader cultural norms. A successful alpha male is expected to have an unofficial harem and demonstrate his masculinity by engaging in affairs with numerous beautiful women. As political scientist Ekaterina Shulman aptly put it, Russia is ruled by old libertines who can't even remember what their own children look like. After the collapse of the USSR, a massive number of churches were built in Russia. Priests are invited to all significant events, prayers are said, and everything from spacecraft to missiles intended to fall on Ukraine is blessed. Traditional icons have become a must-have in the offices of officials. Why? Because the president believes it's the right thing to do. He himself is deeply religious and firmly believes he has a special relationship with God. I'll explain why this is so in one of my upcoming videos where I will examine Vladimir Putin's psychological profile. If you are interested, subscribe and stay tuned for updates. In reality, Russia is a deeply secular country. According to official statistics, 73% of the population identifies as Christian, but only 15% go to church regularly, at least once a month. And those who do are mostly elderly. When the war began, many Russian intellectuals were horrified. It was unfathomable. How could people support this war? Maybe they just didn't know. Maybe they needed to be explained what was happening. During the first year of the war, the Russian internet was ablaze with heated debates as anti-war individuals tried to reason with those who believed in state propaganda. But nothing came of it. Every argument was dismissed, logic didn't matter, and in response to any counterpoint, the Patriot would claim, "You are all being zombified by the West, and you can't see the obvious." The official propaganda presented the following formula. We are a great country. We will defeat everyone, and everything will be fine for us. You don't have to do anything, think about anything, or make tough decisions. The government will tell you what to do. All your problems stem from the schemes of the West and Russian traitors. The opposing side offered a different formula. We are citizens of an aggressor nation, committing unimaginable crimes against our neighbors, friends, and relatives. We will all be held accountable. We are headed for shame, sanctions, and economic ruin. So, which version do you think people prefer to believe, just to feel better about themselves? It seemed that by the third year of the war, people should have figured out what was true and what was false. But in reality, those who believe the propaganda don't want to figure anything out. It's too scary, too shameful, and too painful. They are simply protecting themselves from self-destruction. First and foremost, this group includes older people. Many individuals over 60 genuinely believe everything they see on TV. There are countless heartbreaking situations where people have argued with their parents, tried to convince them of the truth, and ended up either cutting off communication or avoiding difficult topics altogether. There are likely several reasons for this. The older generation is accustomed not to seek information, instead trusting whatever the television tells them. This mindset was ingrained in them as children raised in the USSR, where there was only one narrative, one truth, and no moral dilemmas. Quite convenient, right? The older generation relies on government pensions, which makes them entirely dependent on the state. They cannot change their fate, leave, or achieve independence. Conflict with the government causes them subconscious terror, so they automatically, by definition, side with it. The older generation is nostalgic for their youth, and the idea of restoring the USSR seems attractive to them. Back then, we lived so harmoniously, so well. In reality, there wasn't much harmony or comfort, but memories of youth are always romanticized. It's important to note that nearly all high-ranking officials fall into this category. They don't speak foreign languages, don't use the internet much or at all, and they can't stand any criticism or disapproval because in Russian culture this is seen as undermining their social status. As a result, they filter out any negative information, creating their own informational bubble that feeds itself. Here's how it works. Remove everyone from television who promotes an alternative opinion, then watch that same TV and base your worldview on it, drawing conclusions from what you see. If any negative information somehow reaches the higher echelons, it's immediately dismissed as Western propaganda, because it doesn't match their familiar worldview. There's a whole group of people who call themselves Russian patriots. They passionately love their homeland and sincerely believe in everything we've mentioned above. They don't pretend to support Putin's actions. They truly believe that Ukraine should not exist as an independent state, that the Ukrainian nation doesn't exist, they are just lost Russians. This group resembles the German romantics of the 19th century. They endlessly discuss the distant past, the messianic ideas, and the great Russian culture. They write uplifting poems, paint pictures, and hold all sorts of events. In essence, they are religious fanatics who believe in their great mission. These people live in a fantasy world where reality simply does not match their imagination. But that doesn't bother them. Most of them have a shallow understanding of history, hold extreme nationalist view, and have little grasp of how other nations live and what they experience. In Russia, unfortunately, there is a widespread desire to join those who are winning. Many people are technically against the war, but since they are already started, they wish for Putin to win. After all, it's better than losing. The narrative that only traitors can be against their people in difficult times is gaining traction. It's important to mention that patriotism is often used as a cover for those who don't have any real convictions and are simply profiting from the war. This can take many forms. Some get government contracts, some keep their well-paying jobs, some work at military factories earning much more than before, while avoiding the risk of potential mobilization. I've been told multiple times about wives persuading their husbands to enlist in the army to defend the motherland. The catch is that this defense might end in death or injury, but that's okay. The family of the dead or wounded will receive huge sums of money by the standards of Russia's rural areas. There's also this example. Before the war, many Ukrainians came to Russia for work. Ukraine was much poorer, so talented young men and women came to Moscow and St. Petersburg with little more than a suitcase, trying desperately to establish themselves. Some of them made great careers. And now, with the war underway, these people faced a moral dilemma. Should they abandon everything they've built and return to Ukraine to save their country, or should they defend their life choices in the hope that the Russians won't remember that they are from the enemy camp? Of course, many made a deal with the devil. Russian propaganda doesn't want people to have a clear picture of the world in their minds. Clarity of thought leads to action. It's much more beneficial to flood a person with information and give them dozens of versions of events that contradict each other. Who has time to sort through all of this, especially when the events in question are far away and don't seem particularly relevant to you? That's what happened with the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. They immediately threw out a dozen versions of the story. The same thing happened with the invasion of Ukraine. It was all too complicated, too confusing, so it was easier to say to themselves, "We'll never know the whole truth," avoid forming any opinion, and go on with their everyday lives. People who adopt the not everything is so clear-cut approach don't even realize that they are victims of propaganda, and that the authorities are intentionally confusing them. The largest group of Russians consists of those who do their best to ignore the war. They don't want to talk about it and just try to live their lives. They have no opinion about what's happening. They don't watch propaganda and aren't interested in politics. Their world consists of work, family affairs, vacations, and small joys. They know something bad is happening in the country, but any attempt to drag them into politics triggers immediate resistance. "We can't change anything anyway." This is their typical statement. These people don't support the war and would be relieved if it ended. However, many work in military enterprises, courts, the police, and schools, contributing to the state's totalitarian system. Some of them even sign contracts to fight in Ukraine. This all happens without malice or much regret. After all, it's just a job, and they need to provide for their families. The indifferent also don't realize that they are victims of propaganda, and that the idea that nothing depends on them has been deliberately drilled into their heads for decades. If you can't change anything, go along with the system. Take advantage of opportunities as they arise, and avoid sticking your neck out or taking initiative, because doing so will result in severe punishment. These people will accept any outcome of the war, even if their government says the true purpose of the attack on Kiev was to dispose of the Black Sea Fleet and oil processing plants so they wouldn't pollute the environment. We can also consider refugees and those who resisted the propaganda but still suffered from it as victims. Over the years of the war, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, have left Russia. It's the same as what happened during Nazi Germany. Scientists, artists, engineers, and entrepreneurs left in droves. An unprepared departure is incredibly difficult. Many people live with nothing, with no savings. Many barely speak foreign languages or don't speak them at all. But there's no choice, because anyone who has ever voiced support for democracy, free elections, or other nonsense could be arrested and imprisoned. Cultural figures who spoke out against the war in Ukraine lost their ability to teach, perform, or publish. Many have been blacklisted and legally forced to call themselves foreign agents. In essence, the title of foreign agent in Russia is a Medal of Honor. It means you haven't remained silent and you are still doing something useful. But of course, propaganda does everything it can to vilify the refugees and foreign agents as much as possible. The creators of Russian propaganda can be divided into the following categories. Television propagandists. These are the people who appear on federal channels, have massive audiences, and constantly stir up viewers with terrifying stories about Ukrainian Nazis. They shout a lot, accuse, insult, and are outright rude. They work skillfully, move as part of a unified front, and promote the narratives and explanations that the bosses need, here and now. They make astronomical amounts of money for their skill set. Ideological volunteers. This group mostly resides on social media, trying to inspire their followers with passionate articles, songs, poems, and so on. Some sincerely believe in the ideas of Imperial Russia and consider them to be a good thing. Others simply try to speak on topics that are approved by the state. Paid commentators. These people just show up to work. They are given assignments and carry them out, leaving the necessary comments across the internet. The Z community. It consists of thousands of Telegram channels that emerged in response to the lack of reliable information. Official propaganda tries to calm citizens, saying everything is under control and that officials and the military are handling everything. But this is obviously not true. Enthusiasts in the Z community try to share what's really happening. They raise issues about the army and the rear lines, hoping that officials will hear them and begin to address the problems. Small channels are much more active in sharing the truth because they aren't afraid of Comrade Major. These people are aware of what's happening, yet they continue to support the war in Ukraine and believe in the official propaganda narratives. Why can't they connect the dots and see the clear reasons behind their problems? It seems that the main issue lies in the fears I mentioned above, particularly the fear of losing their identity as the forces of good. The Z community is quite diverse. It includes military personnel and volunteers who provide tents, socks, camouflage nets, and other supplies. Among them are enthusiastic ladies, the wives and mothers of soldiers, adventurers, and outright crazies. They are enthusiasts delivering humanitarian aid to the front lines, along with doctors, pilots, and artists. Many top artists have left Russia, but those who had been in the shadows before the war have stepped into the spotlight. Now, they do their best to prove their loyalty to the government and its supporters. Comrade Major keeps a close eye on the Z community. If a channel starts gaining hundreds of thousands of subscribers, they try to co-opt it. They put the channel on a payroll and tell their author what to write and what not to write. If the author insists on their own version of events, they face consequences. One such author committed suicide, another was killed in Africa, and the third is now in prison. The truth is, the Russian rulers have no use for these activities because they demand social problems to be addressed, corruption be eradicated, and order be restored within the army. Some of them even aspire to power, which is completely unacceptable. In reality, these enthusiasts are deeply unhappy and feel betrayed by fate. Their biggest problem is that the vast majority of the population doesn't support the war in Ukraine in the way they wish. Donations are scarce. There are not enough volunteers, and soldiers can only be recruited with huge amounts of money. Opposition members are outraged by the indifference of the overwhelming majority of people to the tragedy in Ukraine. But that same indifference also extends to the Z community. Z community researcher Ivan Filipov states that no more than 7% of the population wants the war to continue and to win. Moreover, none of them can explain what exactly they are fighting for and what victory will look like. There's another nuance. War heroes won't be welcome home. Everybody knows that when the war ends, Russia's cities will be filled with people who have gotten used to killing and forcibly taking wherever they want. What's more, they'll bring weapons with them, along with countless diseases, injuries, and mental illnesses. In short, for Russia, the end of the war will not mark the end of anything. Russian propaganda is effective because it has money, the power to use violence against anyone who disagrees, and because it consistently taps into the fundamental fears of the Russian people. The only way to fight propaganda is to offer alternative narratives and show that there is nothing to fear. But this must be done before a global-scale social problem grows like an uncontrollable infection. While Putin dismantled independent media, the West looked away. While he was eliminating the opposition, everyone pretended nothing alarming was happening. And now, there's no one left to speak to the Russian people. All channels of communication have been cut off. If someone were to ask me how to change this, I would suggest a counterintuitive approach. First, trust needs to be built, not with the rulers, but with ordinary people. If the West tries to convince Russians that we will never attack you or we don't want to tear apart your country, no one will believe it. But we can work with their fear of rejection. If Russians feel accepted and valued, that is something undeniable. And at that point, propaganda loses its power. Do you know who makes the most noise in the Z community, cursing America at every turn? Russian writers. Many of them tried to get their books into the American market but failed, and that makes them furious. I don't know a single instance when an American literary agent would accept a submission from a Russian-speaking writer with no connections. This is not Russophobia. American literary agents generally don't accept foreign writers, with very few exceptions, which is why only 3% of books published in the US are translations from all over the world. But our writers feel it's because of Russophobia. Simply allowing some Andrei or Sergei to publish their fantasy novels on Amazon and making a living from it would eliminate the enemy. They would be writing books about space exploration, not anti-American rants. But no, if you live in Russia, you can't be successful in America. You have the wrong passport, bank account, and tax filings. One single positive article on BBC or CNN about Russian inventors would shatter the most fundamental myth of Putin's propaganda. No one will ever love or appreciate you outside of Russia. Either you work for me or you don't work at all. You don't need to work hard. You need to work smart. As a bonus, I recommend the video by Professor Geddes, Into Warfare, How to Never Be Fooled by disinformation. The link is in the description. Goodbye for now. Subscribe. See you soon.